Hello and welcome to this Museum at Home webinar on Anzac Day traditions. I'm Amanda Dennett, Head of Digital Experience at the Australian War Memorial. Since the landing at Gallipoli in 1915, many traditions have developed to help us commemorate veterans past and present. In this webinar, we'll take a closer look at the traditions that have come to be associated with Anzac Day and how they've evolved, from the humble beginnings of the Anzac biscuit to the excitement of a TwoUp game. Joining me today is Dr. Meleah Hampton, a historian in our military history section who's been with the Australian War Memorial since 2013. Her primary interest is in the operational conduct of the First World War and on the Western Front. She's a graduate of the University of Adelaide and completed her PhD with a thesis on the 1916 battles for Poitiers and Mouquet Farm. Dr. Hampton is a member of the editorial staff of the Memorials magazine in wartime and continues to research and write biographies for the Last Post ceremony, which we hold at the Memorial 364 days a year. Thanks for joining me, Mel.
Thanks for having me.
So today this is an interactive webinar. Please send us through your questions using the chat or Q&A buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So to start us off today, Mel, can you talk to us about how Anzac Day came to be known as such?
Yes, so Anzac Day obviously relates back to the first Anzac Day, which is the landing on Anzac Cove in the pre-dawn light of the 25th of April 1915, and it's been tied to that ever since. Obviously it's changed over the years and things have become a little bit different as time's gone by, but initially it was specifically to remember those who had fallen, and it was commemorated throughout the war as well. So during the war we had a number of different days that were marked, I guess. There was Wattle Day and Violet Day and Empire Day and those sorts of things. They were often used as signs of patriotism, fundraising for the war effort, those sorts of things. Anzac Day rose above all of those because of its strong tie to that first moment of war.
And so some of those early kind of commemorative activities were actually perhaps a bit more sort of patriotic and, as you say, fundraising. So but today, you know, the commemorations that occur on Anzac Day are sort of deliberately a bit more sombre. Today there's sort of a reflection back to those lost. So how did that evolution happen over time?
I guess Anzac Day has become a lot of different things over time because it is what the Australian people need it to be when they have it, you know. So it's not something that became established and has never changed since. It evolves and is quite fluid as time passes on. So when the war is on, it is being used for both commemoration and fundraising and like a sign of like, this is our community's patriotism and all of those sorts of things, a grim determination to finish this war. There's all sorts of different reasons to have it. And then in the years immediately following, it's a chance for the men who were there and saw these things happen and saw things happen in the subsequent years of the war to come together and hold that commemoration with the only other people who really truly know what it was like. Yeah. Then there's the families who are missing faces at the table, the neighbourhood who are missing people down the road. And as those generations pass by, it becomes different things to people who aren't missing a face or didn't see the war, but it remains important the whole way along.
So one of the, I guess, most important rituals of Anzac Day is the dawn service, and we hold the dawn service for the nation at the Memorial each year. Can you tell us how did a service at dawn come to be associated with Anzac Day? What's the significance behind gathering together at that time?
There's a couple of things we talk about in terms of dawn services. One is why we would have it at dawn, and it's usually tied to things like the morning stand to, where the men in the trenches during the war, dawn is a really handy time to conduct an operation because you can launch it in the dark before the enemy can see you, and then you can finish it off in the light when you can see what you're doing. So it's a really it's a time for a lot of operations to go ahead. And because of that, it's also a time to be on alert every morning in case the enemy does the same sort of thing. So it's a time of quiet reflection for the men in the trenches as they stand silently waiting for an attack as much as anything else. It's also the time of the landing. They landed on Gallipoli, so that's an example of that. So it ties into the time of the landing as well. The other thing we talk about is when the first one was. And there are a few great contenders when the first one was. There's a story that has been told by Ken Inglis, the historian, about a group of soldiers on a night out the night before Anzac Day who met a grieving mother at the cenotaph, and they, between them, resolved to hold a dawn service. There's a padre in Western Australia who was holding them very early. There are really early ones in Toowoomba in Queensland. And I think the lesson to take from all of that is not which one was the first, because the lesson is that this is an instant tradition. It's something that instantly resonates with the people who come into contact with a dawn service. It feels right. It's a sort of sacrifice of your time and effort that people want to come together and commemorate that event. And so it's an immediately resonant activity that springs up all over the place.
So this year, Anzac Day and the dawn service is going to look different at the memorial. You need a ticket to come to that event, and those tickets have been exhausted. That happened quite early because unfortunately we can't have as many people on site this year as we would traditionally have because of COVID restrictions. And certainly last year was completely different, where we weren't able to hold public ceremonies at all, and that was just televised. So the last couple of years have really been quite different in terms of dawn service, but what we did see was a bit of a grassroots campaign sort of through the RSLs for their Light Up the Dawn campaign, and a move towards commemoration at home. So going to stand out perhaps in your on your balcony or at the end of your driveway at dawn in order to commemorate and as a sign of personal reflection. And we received some feedback last year from people that, whilst they might not have felt comfortable coming to a dawn service because they perhaps don't have someone in their family who served, that they did go out to the end of their driveway with their family and see who else was out there and commemorate. So they were able to participate in a way that they never had before. Can you talk to us a little bit, I guess, about, as we delve into some of the traditions, which ones should we follow? Which ones are some more meaningful than others? And how can we engage in commemoration as individuals? Because everyone does have a different experience.
They do, and it's one of those things where people sometimes ask, how should people remember Anzac Day? And I don't think there's a should. Like, there are large swathes of the population who aren't interested in our military history, and that is fine. Like, that's not a problem as well. But these days, we're people who, very few of us are remembering someone specific who's been lost in war, which is one of the more fortunate things of our society. But we have got a family legacy of lost uncles or grandfathers, or, just a legacy of service and those sorts of things. So it becomes quite personal, your choice in what you do. Like I said before, Anzac Day has been really fluid, and there has been previous pandemics where people have chosen not to come together and have dawn services or parades or anything else. And so I really actually enjoyed the end of the driveway business, because it takes all of those personal motivations for doing it and make it extremely personal. It's just you and your dog on the driveway with your slippers, in my case. And helps people to reflect on why they're doing these things. Yeah,
without necessarily a crowd. And I thought the feedback about, maybe not coming to a dawn service because there wasn't a strong family connection, is really valid. That and so having an alternative was really meaningful to people. So I'm sure we'll see a lot of participation at home as well this year, and the RSL's continuing with that campaign, so that'll be nice to see. And of course, people will be sharing their photos on how they commemorate on Anzac Day using the hashtag Anzac at home. So if you're commemorating from home on Anzac Day, please share yours with us.
A family connection is like not, it's really important to some people, but there are so many really dedicated people who are really like focused on commemoration who don't have a family connection, and that like there are some people without a family connection or even an extensive Australian history who have engaged with our military history and are doing really important things in the commemorative space.
And there is I guess that that just overarching story of loss and grief and that and sacrifice, really, that most of us can really it resonates with us no matter what the connection is. So, it's good to have those stories shared each year, and people can sort of take some moments to reflect for themselves. So, following the dawn service, for some people, there can be a traditional gunfire breakfast, although it's definitely not a nationwide tradition.
I had never heard of it, so I came to the East Coast. Congratulations, East Coast, you've taught me something.
So, can you talk to us a bit about the gunfire breakfast and what are the origins of that tradition?
Well, I think being awake at 4:30 and needing to go and get breakfast is a thing wherever you are. My uncle and I do it. We used to do it every year. Over here, we refer to it as a gunfire breakfast, which apparently has traditions to do with an English military tradition of gunfire, just something to get you going in the morning before an early morning parade, really. So I think that's where the term has come from, and the action has come from a necessity to get breakfast after being up in a really chilly morning.
Yeah. And I think that the types of foods that you can eat, really, there's no set. There's some traditions of, and I think some that have evolved over time with sort of bacon and eggs on a roll, and just, as you say, things that are easy and sort of transportable and sort of quick, I guess. Harking back to those early traditions. So
I like the idea of doing the same thing with the same people every year, and like I said, my uncle and I having breakfast together has been really important, but I had no idea there was a name for it.
Yes, there you go. And we do have a couple of recipes on the Memorial's website, including one for a gunfire breakfast, which is at awm.gov.au/Anzac at home. You can find that and some other recipes there if you're looking for a breakfast after the dawn service this year. So a really important tradition and quite a solemn one is the reciting of the Ode, which happens at services on Anzac Day. I'm going to test you now, Mel, and ask you to recite the Ode, but also to tell us about its origins, because certainly, I have strong memories at school of being in Anzac Day services and people reciting the Ode. It is a really strong tradition. Can you talk to us about it?
Yeah, this is one of those traditions that doesn't change and is present everywhere you hold an Anzac Day ceremony. The Ode comes from a poem that was written in 1914 by a poet called Lawrence Binyon, and it's called For the Fallen, and I believe it is the fourth stanza of the poem. And it reads, "They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them." And then that is followed by the congregation saying, "We will remember them." And then whoever's leading says, after a period of silence, "Lest we forget." And then you repeat back, "Lest we forget." Those words, I think, were another instant resonation with people who are losing people. That young man isn't going to grow old, and we are, and we're going to leave them behind. And so it became formally attached to services of commemoration quite quickly, just because it summed up so much of what people were thinking and feeling at the time.
And it is one that, as it's recited, it does sort of make you pause and really shift your focus onto what's been lost. It's quite powerful at doing that in one short stanza, really. It
really is, and for Australians in particular, having dawn services, this is something that is a wider Commonwealth tradition. It's not an Australian thing. Lawrence Binyon was English, but for us holding dawn services, it has at the going down of the sun and in the morning has that particular resonation for us.
And so another tradition that translated from the battlefields to our commemorative activities on Anzac Day is the bugler playing the last post. And so the last post is played by a bugler every day at the memorial except Christmas Day at our last post ceremony, which you can live stream each day. And so it's a sound that's really common around here, but for many Australians, they perhaps will only experience it on Anzac Day. What is the significance? When was the last post played on the battlefield, and how did that translate over to the ceremonies that we hold today?
We come from being British colonies, and so a lot of British military traditions have just been absorbed by Australia as a nation. And the last post is one of those ages-old traditions of the British. The story, as I understand it, is that there are bugle calls that sort of control movements of a military camp throughout the day. Various bugle calls mean various things. And the last bugle call of the night, as the posts are being checked around, the last bugle call is the last post to signify that everything's checked and the camp is now in readiness for the night. Now it applies as remembrance to say that this is that person's last act and they are now ready for their next role, so in the afterlife. So there's a real sense of transition of the person we are commemorating as having passed on. The last post says this is the end of their task on earth and the beginning of their task in the future. So it has a sort of pseudo-Christian sort of implication as well.
Yeah. And it is really quite powerful to have that played on Anzac Day, but also at the last post ceremony. It really does bring, it really does symbolise a moment of change. And
it couches the minute's silence as well. So we have that minute's silence with the last post played around it.
Yeah.
With the last post and then Reveille, the awakening call, bugle call.
Yeah.
So it's something that everyone's quiet and listening to, and then there's silence and thought about it, and then the bugle comes in and wakes you up out of that as well.
So the Anzac Day March is another really important Anzac Day tradition. And again, as we said earlier about the dawn service, the Anzac Day March will be different at the memorial this year. We'll be holding a banner parade and not an Anzac Day March because of limitations with COVID restrictions. But how did the march come about? Has it always been a tradition? And I guess like we've had to adapt over the last year or two with COVID restrictions. Has the march always been the same way, or is that something that has evolved over time?
Yeah, that's evolved over time too. But one of our earliest signs of military activity in Australia was the formation of units that marched off to war in parades down main streets, George Street and King William Street, and so we have these ranks of men going off to war, and after the war they held parades of the same men who had come back. They had parades coming off the troop ships coming home, and I think it was a natural thing to create a commemorative parade on Anzac Day, especially because a lot of these early diggers, that often they never talked about their experience in the war at all until they all came together on Anzac Day. There's lots of those sorts of stories where men wouldn't open up about it until they were with their mates and they only saw them on Anzac Day.
Yeah.
So those parades that are held all around Australia are really full of ex-servicemen and sometimes ex-service women, nurses and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Now, they have changed over time as well as that generation died away, as a new conflict was fought. There's more people to include. There's people who are gone just because they've died. There's people who are gone because they are finished with the process. And as you know, more and more World War servicemen and women have passed away, and more people are serving in peacekeeping operations or other kind of operations, the whole thing is shifted. Now we have families of men who marched every year. Like, just having them not be able to do that has meant that we've opened up and often included family members to serve on behalf of men and women for whom that tradition was so important. So it's changed a lot this year. Obviously in Canberra we are changing it again, and that's one of those things I say where Anzac Day is there to meet the needs of the population, not to have the population fulfil the needs of Anzac Day. It's just to help people with where they're at.
And in terms of the march, it is interesting that that family involvement, and we'll talk a little bit later about the wearing of medals at marches. But what is the significance, I guess, of having each? Is the representation of various kind of units or battalions or squadrons, is that important, and is that reliant on sort of associations being motivated to participate, or what are some of the dynamics behind the march? Because there, as you say, there are really active participants, and then others perhaps where there's lesser representation.
Yeah, you often find that a large number of people from the same area go into the same unit because of reasons, or you also find people who serve in different units choosing where they march as well. So it depends on the location of the march, who is participating, and which RSL is organising it, as to how it works. But I think the important thing is that there's a space for all. If you've served, then there will be a space for you somewhere. There are some people I've spoken to who have served as, for example, journalists and cameramen and women with the Defence Force, and they find there's not units for them to serve in, but they find places. There's places for them.
Yeah, great. And we should clarify, really, you raised a good point that the marches are run by the RSLs and owned really strongly by the veterans and associations themselves. So whilst one is held outside the memorial and certainly sort of finishes and passes through here, it's not our tradition. It's one that's born of the veterans themselves, and that's really significant.
It absolutely is, and the one here has some very strong traditions about how it's run, and being led by the horse with the reversed boots and things that I'm not familiar with because it's not a strong tradition from Adelaide. So all of those things are area specific.
Yeah. So many of us will associate the poppy with remembrance, but on Anzac Day it is rosemary that is worn as a symbol of remembrance. So can you talk to us about the significance of rosemary and how should it be worn? Are there some rules about that?
There probably are some rules about that. So rosemary is something that we're often told that it's because it grows wild on Gallipoli, which is something that I had to have a look into not like a few years ago, and I can find no evidence that at the time of the landing it was growing wild on Gallipoli.
There you go.
Somebody did a botanical survey of the peninsula somehow in like 1912 or something, just before the landing, and didn't record rosemary as growing wild on the peninsula. There was a low-growing shrub with purple flowers, though, which is what rosemary is.
There you go.
But this was a different sort. Yeah. So anyway, that's one of the things that we as Australians assume, and do you know what? That's fine because
hung on to it.
It definitely grows wild on the peninsula now, probably because we took it there to commemorate people. But rosemary is actually a really traditional old herb that is associated with remembrance since the time of Shakespeare and long before. So there's a Shakespeare play where he says there's rosemary that's for remembrance. And so that's grown out of our growth of a nation as a British colony. We've carried that in with us. And so while we've forgotten the ages-old connotation and attached it to Anzac Day, it's are just strongly associated with remembrance, and we have chosen to really strongly associate it with Gallipoli in particular.
And so it is just worn, I mean, on Anzac Day you will just see people have it pinned to the lapel, and so that's just as simple as taking some from the garden, and there are often traditions associated with the wearing of poppies or medals, as we discussed, but I think just the act of wearing something is something that any of us can do at home.
A sprig on your lapel, and that's fine. These days too, poppies have sort of come into it. You can wear a poppy with a rosemary sprig quite comfortably, I think.
Yep.
Poppies have long been associated with Remembrance Day.
Yes.
But they're beautiful and they do also grow wild on Gallipoli, so let's do it.
Yeah. And so for Anzac Day, though, the poppy traditionally has appeared as a wreath, though, and more recently it's sort of come to be worn as well by people who, I think it sort of resonates with as a symbol. But can you talk to us about the poppy wreath and the tradition behind that?
Yeah, wreaths and bunches of flowers and those sorts of things have been long important in terms of particularly gravesites and memorial points of remembrance like that. One of the real shocks of the First World War for families at home were not being able to tend to graves or visit graves or, you know, be there while someone died. You know, like to know that your son died on his own in a battlefield is really traumatic for Australians. And it is one of the reasons that the War Memorial was born. We are in part a memorial to all those men, and people could come here and treat it as a gravesite and leave flowers or other tokens of remembrance, and Anzac Day becomes a focused point of time to do that. And so, you know, for families which would be used to having these well-worn sort of acts of sorrow and mourning, had to be cut off with no grave and none of these traditions to be able to go and take care of the grave and that sort of thing, it becomes problematic. And so Anzac Day ceremonies and the laying of flowers and wreaths becomes important.
Yeah. And we know, including from the image behind us, about the importance of the roll of honour and those names and the ability to place a poppy there. And, you know, particularly last year for COVID, people weren't able to visit and to place their poppy, and so last year and again this year we've created a virtual poppy wall where you can leave a message of remembrance online and place a poppy online. If that's something that you're interested in, you can visit lestweforget.gov.au, and we've had quite a few people participate already, and you can see messages of people remembering a grandfather or great uncle or you know, and all these years later really commemorating someone that they've never met and just heard about through family stories. So it's quite nice to see that reflected online, while we know that not everyone can travel.
Yeah, the last post ceremony that we've done here has been really, I think, important in bringing individuals to people's notice and helping people just find someone who has otherwise been forgotten and just noticing them again.
Yeah,
I think that's nice.
And that everyone's story you know, is worth being told, and having that that moment of remembrance is really nice.
Yeah,
and it is quite powerful, whether it's on Anzac Day or at the last post ceremony, to see strangers pausing from their day to remember someone. It's sort of a reminder of community, I guess, and remembrance.
Yeah, and we come from this nation that suffered that massive trauma. We're still those people, and we still feel their pain that was so immediate. We're carrying it on for them
as
a century later.
Yeah. So let's talk medals next, because I sort of referenced that a bit earlier when we were talking about marches, and so people wear rosemary and poppies on Anzac Day, but of course they wear medals. So they'll wear the medals that they've gained themselves through service. They're worn on the left. Increasingly, family members or loved ones wear the medals of their family member, and so is that a newer tradition, or
it is a new tradition? Yeah. And there are quite strict rules around how medals are used in the military in particular. So medals are awarded by the military for service and to start with, and then for particularly meritorious service in special occasions. So there are service medals and there are awards and distinctions that are also medals, and in the past they have been only supposed to have been worn by the person who was awarded those medals, and they are worn on the left. These days people are wearing in the same reason, people have joined marches in memory of a loved one who participated in them. They wear the medals of the loved one who wore them with such pride. Now, those medals should always be worn on the right, because it is an affront to the people who have earned them to wear them on the left to see people wearing them on the same side.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates that this is an act of respect and remembrance, not an act of having participated in the event.
Yeah.
So it is important for people to remember that. It is also important that they're not replicas. They should be the original medals, or the person should be commemorated in another way. So those would be the things that wouldn't cause offence to serving members who have earned those medals.
Yeah.
Still paying respect to the person that you are remembering, but by wearing them on the right.
And so if you want to march but only have replicas, perhaps then it's marching without medals and having your own. I've seen people as well sort of marching with a photo pinned and some rosemary, and so there's many ways that people.
Yeah, I would say I have pictures on T-shirts too.
Yeah.
I've been to the battlefields in France and Belgium a lot, and one of the things that always resonates with people is when someone leaves a photograph of the person, even more than their medals. Like if they leave a photograph of a person at a grave, they attract poppies where other people have come and thought of that person.
Yeah.
So engaging with the face of your loved one is a really lovely way of doing it, I think.
And it's quite interesting over time about the wearing of medals on the left or right, and I guess the changing face of what a veteran looks like, as you flagged earlier, that after the World Wars, some of the operations have shifted into sort of peacekeeping, humanitarian. Younger veterans today, including women and people who served from Australia but perhaps started life as a refugee from another nation, and so there's strong Indigenous service as well for Australia, and so I guess the face of a veteran this year and the people that we see at marches is really varied now, which is a really positive thing, and I guess also perhaps the wearing of medals on the right or left helps us quite quickly identify who served and who hasn't in terms of an onlooker's perspective. It's
so ingrained in the military that they will instantly know, even if civilians don't notice, like you're trying to work out which one's your left and which one's your right, that there are people who are very aware of what's going on. I think the other thing to say too about Anzac Day is while it was so deeply entrenched in the loss, like literally the death of a generation, and it's really mired in the death of these people, I don't think what the people who were engaging in Anzac Day realised was that it was also contributing to people who were still alive. War and operations and service cost people in ways beyond death, just dying on service. It can cost you your mental health, it can cost you your time, your effort, and Anzac Day has, even before people were talking about it in those terms, has served those people who were struggling with mental health issues or, sorrow over missing the birth of a child or all sorts of things. It costs all sorts of things. And these days, it's no different. And so we're looking at those people and commemorating their act as servicemen and women and what it's cost them, whatever it is.
Yeah, and so there's in marching and wearing the medals, there's personal reflection on sort of one's own service, and perhaps others who didn't return home with them, or as you say, just lost time with loved ones at home that they won't get back. So that's a really important reflection. We've got a few traditions left to cover, but if you've got questions that you'd like to ask us, please send them through the chat and we will try to get to those ones. So the next tradition to cover is the Anzac biscuit, and it is the afternoon, so we might get hungry after talking about the gunfire breakfast and Anzac Day bickies. But how did a biscuit come to be such an important tradition and part of Anzac Day? Because I don't really know of other foods that are sort of so strongly associated with a
dodgy rolled cookie.
Yeah, with a day of remembrance. So can you talk to us about the Anzac bicky?
Yeah, so the men of Anzac were sent tins and comfort tins and things, and biscuits were part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Also plum puddings, but biscuits are easier to make now.
Yeah.
So the Anzac biscuit is a biscuit that is not perishable, like it lasts for a really long time. And so I think usually it was made without eggs, although some recipes do have eggs in them, but it's got golden syrup in it and rolled oats, and is made to last as long as possible, and it goes from mum's oven to her son. It's like this lovely little link to home and a special little treat for men who are sitting in a trench on a peninsula. And they came to mean a great deal. They also mean a great deal for the women who are stuck at home a bit impotent and not able to do very much to help. There's only so many socks you can knit and letters you can write, and cooking biscuits was another thing they could do. So.
Yeah, a way to contribute from afar.
Yeah, feel like they were doing something, and they were. It was making a big difference.
And so Anzac biscuits are sold, they're in supermarkets at the moment. We find them each year. In the lead up to Anzac Day. And so nowadays they're sort of used for fundraising, and so that kind of tradition continues of connecting the biscuits and perhaps the proceeds from those to supporting veterans.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the word Anzac is controlled by the government, so you've got to be very careful about what you use it on.
Yeah.
So the formal fundraising Anzac Day Anzac biscuits have been licensed.
Yeah.
And that's been since the end of the war. So people had to apply to call their house Anzac and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
It's not a word that anyone's been able to use willy-nilly, shall we say, since the war.
Yeah. And that's because of its significance. So you don't want it used for sort of marketing purposes or without authorization. Yeah.
Very deliberately to ensure that its resonance was with solemn things. You know, it's not. It was just to curate it and take care of it. I guess didn't turn it into all sorts of crazy things.
Yeah.
But the first Anzac biscuits were just homemade, and there are a lot of different recipes. There's a lot of different ideas on how to make an Anzac biscuit, and in the 20s the newspapers published a lot of them.
Yeah.
So,
some of them look quite different. We've got some examples on our website of one of our curators who baked some different Anzac biscuits. We've got some recipes in the Memorials collection, and some of them have icing, which I'd never heard of as a thing until I worked here. But yeah, the recipes have definitely evolved over time, but we keep going back to the rolled oats and rock hard. And
but just be careful if you're telling someone that's not what an Anzac Day biscuit is. We could probably find an example where it is what an Anzac Day biscuit is.
The recipes are quite varied, so if you're interested in doing your own comparison cooking, we'll share some links as we publish this webinar on YouTube afterwards, so we'll put some recipe links.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty keen to try Di's experiment actually and cook some of my own.
Yeah, they looked really good. She did a good job. So finally, for lots of people, Anzac Day wouldn't be complete without TwoUp at the pub and perhaps a game of footy in the afternoon. And of course, Anzac Day is the only day that TwoUp can be played. So can you talk to us, where did TwoUp come from?
TwoUp is a really old game again, and actually by the time of the First World War it was illegal to play it in Australia. It was seen as the cause of vice and misery, and people could lose everything in TwoUp schools down the back alley, and so it wasn't actually highly regarded in many spheres, but it was super popular to play among the soldiers, both in training in Australia, on the troop ships. When they get away, they will set up schools wherever they can. Should be remembered that the first AIF is a large group of young men, and you have the whole lot, the men who look down on those playing TwoUp and those that are desperate to fleece everyone for every last penny they have. So there's ways of cheating at it. There's the whole scandals of having double-headed pennies and all those sorts of things, but for the most part it's a chance for men to come together, just take a break, hang out and play a game and win some money.
And I really like seeing that at the pub, although I now am normally working at the Memorial on Anzac Day, so no more TwoUp at the pub for me. But I always found it quite intimidating to be honest, because the throngs are so, they kind of get intense, don't they, with people sort of around the circle and...
Yeah, they do. I don't understand it at all.
That's part
I'm
of the
not sure how Australian that makes me, but I don't understand it at all.
I'm a bit the same, but it's definitely sort of something that I associate with Anzac Day because of that environment. But I'm definitely not a pro at TwoUp. Yeah.
It's a really integral part of some people's Anzac Day, like really built into the way they do it.
Yeah.
I have commemorated Anzac Day since I was a teenager and could drive myself to places and never played TwoUp. So again, like all of these things meet people where they want to be met, and so you can or you can't, you don't have to.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to watch other people do it.
Yeah. So that brings us to the last of our traditions. So it's time for some questions now. If you've got some that you'd like to ask, please send them through, and I can put Mel on the spot and ask her about those. But we've had one come in from Ben that's sort of a comment about the wearing of replica medals. And Ben is a serving member and said that he's never marched with his originals because they mean, I guess they're of quite significant value to him, and so has worn replicas. So can you talk to us a bit more about that? What are the rules, and is it a preference? And look, can people sort of choose their own adventure when it comes to
realistically
what their rituals are? Yeah,
people do choose their own adventure. So realistically, you do you, and the rest of us will keep up. I was speaking to a senior naval commander who's in our office at the moment, and he was adamant that replicas shouldn't be worn. And there's no policing of this, and I think it's sound to keep your originals somewhere safe. That seems okay to me. But those guidelines are from the military, and I don't think there's any problem. But that is official advice, is not to wear your replicas. I think that's particularly concerning for people who maybe everyone in the family has had a replica made and they're all wearing replicas rather than keeping an original safe.
Sure.
But I don't know any further than that. I would also say that serving people who have earned their own medals sometimes wear family medals as well. So if you see people with medals on both sides, that's to show both their own service and the service of a family member.
Yeah.
Serving members can't just incorporate family members and whack them on the same service side.
Yeah. So with all the traditions that we've discussed, are there any that have been traditions over time, but that we've sort of lost and no longer observe today simply because things have evolved? I think there are area-specific things that have come and gone. So some places didn't have dawn services. They would have 11 o'clock church services, and they would be specifically held inside churches. Mm-hmm. And each denomination would have their church service at the same time. Other places would have a picnic, like a community picnic, or a community sports day, or both, and they were big deals as well. It is really important to just come together and have a party and play a lot of sport. Yeah.
So those sorts of things have come and gone, and they're specific to the community and never sort of grew into a national pastime, but happened in lots of different places.
Yeah. So we've had a question from Lee about something we mentioned briefly earlier, the going out to the end of your driveway to commemorate. So that the RSL initiative from last year that came about as a result of COVID and an inability for us to gather in groups. So Lee's asked about this, I guess, having the potential to be a new tradition, and about plans to have that tradition again in 2021. So it is a campaign that the RSL is running again. So it's called Light Up the Dawn. If you wanted to Google that, you can find out more. But I think people are being encouraged to, if they're commemorating at home, to watch the dawn service live from the Australian War Memorial on TV. So it'll be on ABC TV, or you can watch it online through our website or ABC iView, and at the end of the dawn service to go out to the end of your driveway or on your balcony and to have your own sort of moments of reflection and perhaps see who else is out there. You might see Mel with her dog in her
My
slippers,
slippers.
as she mentioned earlier. But what do you think, Mel, about the way that Anzac Day will continue to evolve, and as we begin to add these new traditions? Is it easy to get a new tradition off the ground, and where do you think we'll evolve to next in terms of commemoration?
Yeah, I don't know. I quite like the going out to the end of your driveway, because for me it's always been quite a personal thing. Like Anzac Day has not really been about standing around with other people. It's just about taking a pause. Although these days I think about the war most days, being a historian here, so maybe it's not as important. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, as I said a number of times, Anzac Day is there to meet the needs of the Australian people, not the Australian people there to fulfil the requirements of Anzac Day. So as society changes and people need it to do something else, we need to be a bit comfortable about it not being what it used to be. You know, there are traditions that I particularly love, like singing hymns, for example, that vast quantities of Australians are really uncomfortable with. So, you know, I can imagine the hymns dropping away altogether and those sorts of things. But it'll go where we need it to go as society changes.
Yeah. And on, I guess on that, and as society changes, but also the nature of sort of veterans and that representation at marches and services evolves. What room is there, I guess, for the veterans themselves to shape the way that things evolve, and perhaps that is through RSLs?
I think it will be through RSLs. I'm old enough to remember when Vietnam veterans weren't allowed to march.
Yeah.
And
we didn't really talk about that in terms of the changing nature of marches. We did kind of reflect on how they haven't always been the same, but that's obviously a really significant period of difficulty for a group of veterans that didn't have their service recognised. But
that's right. I think that demonstrates the dangers of really trying to maintain it to fit the rules of this is the way it's always been done. It can be really unhealthy sometimes to force things to remain the same as well. And so when I remember when it was opened up to Vietnam veterans, and as like a very young child, obviously, I couldn't really understand why they were eligible. But now we're teaching our children something different, because we have all sorts of servicemen and women included, and it's become something a little bit more to do with the nature of service and a little bit less to do with world wars or specific periods of time. And that's what we've needed it to do, and so that's what it's become.
So there's a question from Brendan about the history of the easing of restrictions on retail and footy, and I think that relates to what we discussed earlier around the use of the word Anzac and government restrictions about that. So perhaps you could talk in just a little bit more detail, because as you said, there are restrictions that have been in place since the end of the First World War. But obviously, you know, Anzac Day is associated with a lot, whether it's football matches or, perhaps some products for sale. Can you give us a little bit more detail?
Yeah, the products, anything that's labelled Anzac has been approved by the government. Anything that's labelled Anzac. But obviously you can call your day Anzac Day, because that's the name of the day. So if you're holding footy matches on Anzac Day, and the traditional football match where hopefully Essendon beats Collingwood every year on Anzac Day, you're talking about it being on Anzac Day, not the Anzac match. So it's not labelled in that way. Yeah,
and I think that some of the examples provided are, if, for example, if you wanted to have a commemorative walk or run and call it the Anzac Day or the Anzac Walk or the Anzac Run, it needs to be held on Anzac Day. And if it isn't...
it would need to be called the something walk on Anzac Day. You can't call it you can't label it the Anzac anything. So the ones that are using it actively in promotion have been approved, and so they would have gone through a process for that. And often it is linked to either commemorative events. So the football, there's obviously periods of silence and reflection. They'll have the bugle play, and often there's quite a strong service connection. And then for other products, there's often
you know, a fundraising element or a percentage might go to veterans' causes. So there's usually some.
There usually is. It's certainly
about
not
that.
It's not something that we as the War Memorial have anything to do with, actually.
No.
It seems like something that would be under our remit, but it's certainly not anything that we decide or oversee or anything else. It's just something that the government of decades ago decided would be appropriate to do.
And if you're interested in the guidelines, you can sort of Google use of the word Anzac, and there's some really, it's quite interesting reading when you can and can't use it, so I encourage you to do that. Well, that's all we have time for this morning or this afternoon for this Museum at Home webinar on Anzac Day tradition. So thanks very much to Mel for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a really good discussion.
And thank you for your questions. They've been really great.
If you don't already follow us on social media, then please do that, particularly around Anzac Day. We'll be sharing a lot of content, including some of the recipes and activities that we've discussed today. And so, yeah, you can get involved in that. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, of course, which is where we'll share a copy of this video. Thanks again for joining us today, and goodbye for now.